Hi folks, welcome back to another very exciting narrated PowerPoint. So this one is the one introducing Wheeler Becker Glover, Volume 1, I believe Chapter 8, Introducing Women's Equality. So let's get right into it. One thing I just want to highlight that is in the text as well is once again we have a reference to the importance of the Second Great Awakening. So, and maybe it's a little reassuring to you, it is to me, that religion is really central to the history of the United States, especially during this period. And religion plays a really important role in some of the really radical social movements of the day. And it will do so particularly in the civil rights movement in the 20th century as well. And the textbook will cover that when you get to it. So religious experience does lead to social activism, and this once again is because of that doctrine of perfectionism. So perfectionism is this idea that it's not enough to make personal gains in terms of sanctification, but we need to rid the world of sin. And so this leads to social activism. Now, the textbook points out that the Southerners will take this in a very different direction, but Northern converts see slavery then as one of these social sins that needs to be obliterated. The textbook also mentions that the Second Great Awakening had a huge number of female converts. And so these women become activists, not only in things like temperance, the anti-prostitution crusades, but they also become very involved in the abolitionist movement. And something that you might remember from high school or even another chapter in the text is that um, there is a great woman author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who helps to, according to Abraham Lincoln anyway, launch the Civil War. So women become active in abolitionism, and as they become active in abolitionism, as they become aware of the rights that they're arguing for folks who are enslaved, they begin to see that they themselves face certain legal inequalities. And what they begin to do then is they begin to take the skills that they've learned as activists along with this new egalitarian vision of how the laws should work. And they apply this not to just the abolition of the slave, but they apply this to women's emancipation. And your textbook includes the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I've pictured here. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, along with a number of those leading abolitionists and then women's rights activists, they are married, and many of them have children. Susan B. Anthony doesn't, but you shouldn't think of feminists as just, the spinster types who have nothing else going on. They actually, many of them have husbands. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had like 5 children or something like that. And there she is with her daughter Harriet. So Mott and Stanton, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton attend the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And there they are refused seats as delegates on just the basis that they're female. And this is in some ways a radicalizing experience for the two women. They return to the United States. They begin to have conversations like most of us do. And this leads them to this idea that really we need to become active not only in pursuing the abolition of slaves, but we need to become active in pursuing rights for women as well, because we also face legal challenges. So on the next slide here, you see a little newspaper clipping from a Seneca Falls, New York newspaper advertising the first convention to discuss women's rights. And this is directly the brainchild of Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony. But women's rights faces a pretty uneven path. So in some ways it's birthed, if you will, at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. This is also an area that was heavily influenced by the Second Great Awakening. And the Seneca Falls produces a document, and you've got a portion of that reproduced in your text. The document invokes the Declaration of Independence, and it basically goes on to list the ways in which women have been wronged by the legal system that has been dominated by men. And it calls for more rights, the most radical of those rights being the right to vote. This was a very radical demand in 1848, and apparently even Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband disagreed with her about the need for women's suffrage. But what the textbook points out is that in the wake of this demand, this growing demand for women's rights, there are changes that are made in the following decades. So you, for example, get women's property rights laws, so that, if you were married and you had property before you got married, this didn't automatically then become your husband's property. There are more liberal divorce laws, etc. So there are some changes. I would also mention, too, it becomes a little less radical for women to speak before what were called mixed audiences, audiences of both men and women. And of course, there are a number of other changes as well, but we don't have time to discuss them. So what happens? Next, we sort of get the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And in the wake of the Civil War, the movement splits. And the first organization that I'll talk about here is the National Woman Suffrage Association. And you don't need to worry about remembering the odds and ends of the specifics for each of the movement. It's just interesting to note that women didn't agree, even women who were united in believing that women should have access to the right to vote. And I think that's important to remember that women don't, maybe that seems obvious, but sometimes feminists all look the same to people who are outside of that movement. But it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony leading the more radical National Women's Suffrage Association. This was an entirely female organization, and it pursued not only the right to vote, which was a more, accepted goal for feminists anyway, but it also pursued such goals as equal pay for women, which we still do not have today, and also divorce law reform. So that's a little bit more radical to go for equal pay and divorce law reform. They also tended to work at the national level, which is why they're called the National Woman Suffrage Association, and continued to push for a national amendment to the Constitution. The other part of the movement was the American Women's Suffrage Association, and that's founded by Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell. So right there you can see Lucy Stone's a little bit radical for her time, not taking her husband's name. That organization just focused almost directly on just getting women the right to vote. And instead of trying to get a national amendment to the Constitution, they worked more at a state-by-state level and tried to pressure individual states to pass amendments that would allow women to vote at the state level. And so these two organizations really work independently of each other, and that really hampers the movement greatly. And so we don't actually see much gain in regard to women's rights between 1865 and 1890. And part of this also is because, in some ways the nation is really preoccupied with the reconstruction of the South and questions surrounding African American rights. And in fact, part of the reason the movement splits is because there was an amendment that was passed allowing African American men to vote, and the more radical organization, the NWSA, rejected that amendment, saying they were not content to be told that it was, quote, the Negro's hour, and they, demanded to be included in the right to vote. So, all right, the movement does continue on, and we have a good moment for the movement in 1890. So the movement unites and changes. In 1890, these two independent organizations merged into the National American Woman Suffrage Association. That's a very unfortunate that it's got such a long acronym, but there it is. Yeah, that's what compromise looks like, I guess. It's complicated. So in 1890, following the merger, we do actually see some success on the issue of allowing women to vote. So 4 states passed laws allowing women to vote. And those states, if you're curious, are Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho. Those are all Western states, which is quite notable for someone like me who studies Western history, because of course there are fewer women there in the West to begin with, and a lot of people have argued that in some ways the West was a place of opportunities for women, although I don't know if you could actually make that argument if you look too closely. What's really important, though, for the movement is that beginning in the Progressive Era, and the Progressive Era is a really complicated era to say, oh, here's when it begins, here's when it ends. But for the sake of simplicity, let's say, 1880s, and it's maybe over by World War I, which is 1918. The National American Women's Suffrage Association begins to change dramatically. The older generation of suffragettes dies off. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton is gone, Susan B. Anthony is gone, and there is this new generation of women leading the drive for the vote. That new generation of suffragists included Carrie Chapman Catt. She's the one pictured for you. Carrie Chapman Catt leads the NAWSA for a number of years. But the next generation of suffragettes also includes someone you've seen before, and that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch. So there's new leadership, and there's also a new ideology. And the new ideology really focuses on how women are like men, but that women are also essentially different from men. So women are essentially different from men. And so what they mean by social housekeeping is that women have these great domestic qualities, right? So we've seen that with the antebellum era. They're really good in the domestic sphere. They're good at dealing with issues regarding children. They're good at dealing with cleanup of the home. And so they should really be asked, or they should be really allowed to bring these special characteristics to bear in the public sphere. So instead of being just domestic housekeepers, we want to apply their housekeeping skills to the social sphere of the public. So they expand the definition of the home to include the nation. So women are going to be should be given the right to vote because they will bring their special qualities to bear on national concerns. In some ways, they would uplift politics. So we're going to actually reform politics because we're good at cleaning things up, and we're especially good at dealing with issues involving women and children. So that's a really important thing because that seems like a less radical challenge to the roles of men. And you'll see this in the chapter. One of the things that men are concerned about is if women have new power, what does that mean about men's power? Does that, does an increase in women's power mean a decrease in men's power? And they're saying, no, no, no. We just want to, we want to help. We want to be women, but we want to apply our womanly skills to politics. I hope I'm explaining that enough for you to make sense of that. So they're not saying, we are the same as men. We are essentially different. So World War I also is incredibly helpful in giving suffrage a boost. And World War I is very helpful because the leaders of the movement really encourage their women to be patriotic because Britain's women were patriotic, and on the basis of their patriotism, that patriotism really boosted their quest for the vote. So that's exactly what women in America did too. They encouraged their women to sell Liberty bonds. They worked for the agencies such as the Red Cross, et cetera, et cetera. And the textbook mentions that on 164. So that's incredibly important. And in part then because of these different things that are going on in the movement, in fact, the government does respond, and Congress does approve the 19th Amendment, in 1920, which allows women to vote. So the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920. I just wanted to show you this picture too. One of the new techniques of this newer generation was also parades and making the movement look more appealing visually, and parades are fun. Who doesn't like a parade, right? So come on out and support the suffragettes, who are dressed in, their finest, and have colorful banners and so on and so forth. You got to remember there's no television or radio, so maybe that sounds like the worst thing in the world, going to a suffragette parade. But back in the early 20th century, hey, what else is there to do, right? Just to wind up with this last slide, I should mention that divisions remain. Those of you who have any experience with feminists today know that even today, feminists are very divided about what they want. So I want to just mention Alice Paul, who's pictured there for you. Alice Paul forms the National Woman's Party, and this is a party that is, again, much more radical with regard to women's rights. She rejected the idea that women deserve the right to vote on their essential differences. She rejected the idea that women deserve the right because they could be social housekeepers. She instead goes back to the original argument of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even more so, that in fact women should be given their rights because women are exactly like men, in that all persons, regardless of gender, have inalienable rights. And that's something else I should mention too, is that even Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as she grew older, she was in some ways rejected by her own group of women's rights activists, because she became increasingly radical as she aged. So she became friends with free love advocates. She really began to question the institution of marriage. Probably most upsetting for a lot of her friends was the fact that Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually tried to come up with a new version of the Bible, which was something she called the Woman's Bible, which used the kind of textual analysis that you're going to read, and sort of brought it forth to make a case that in fact women were equal to men, and this was justified biblically as well, as long as you read the Woman's Bible. So Alice Paul in some ways is hearkening to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, particularly in her later years. The other thing that you should note about Alice Paul and her National Women's Party is that this was the first organization that pushed for an equal rights amendment. So this is something that's already occurring in the 1920s, and she wants a constitutional amendment then, not only granting women the right to vote, but also an equal rights amendment that prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. And this was something that the National American Women's Suffrage Association was definitely not on board with. They were not pushing for any sort of equal rights amendment. Instead, they were pushing for simply an amendment that would allow them to vote. Okay, I think that's it. I think I've covered everything I need to, and good luck with your reading of the chapter.